Countries, can you tell me what was the richest country 400 years ago? If you want to talk about a rich country, I'm probably there, right? Bro, what are you talking about? You were nothing back then. And you were better? That was like the Middle Ages. You had so many problems, like religious wars and some random stuff going on. You were not doing any better. Hey guys, what are you even arguing about? It's not even close. Wait, India, you were the richest? Oh yeah, by a landslide. And for starters, our wealth began because we had very fertile lands which produced a lot of crops such as rice, wheat, sugarcane. Back then, we were under the rule of the Mughal Empire, so the empire back then was rich. Like, we produced so much stuff that we fed everyone and then we had a surplus. And we didn't just grow food, like obviously food is important, but we also grew so much more stuff such as cotton, textiles, and spices. And bro, our cotton and silk were famous worldwide. Unlike anything you'd ever see, like the fabrics were light, durable, beautifully dyed with vibrant colors. And rich people used to come here just to get our fancy stuff. And we were a big country, even bigger than what we are right now, but 3 cities really made a difference, and they were Delhi, Agra, and Surat. Delhi, for example, had the court, which basically made decisions that affected the whole empire. Agra had a lot of markets, and it was a cultural and commercial hub, and it had like a lot of arts, architecture, and trade. And Surat was basically the empire's gateway to the sea, like the main port where the ships arrived from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Oh, you know how I told you we were a huge country and we were very diverse? So usually there would be problems between religions, races, and stuff like that, right? Well, usually? Well, that wasn't the case here because the ruler back then, Akbar, who ruled from 1556 to 1605, knew that we had a lot of different people. And he was like, well, we cannot have a good country with our people fighting. He created policies that respected the beliefs of different people and different religions, especially those of Hindus and Muslims. But he didn't even stop there. He went further by welcoming scholars, artists, and religious thinkers from different faiths to his court. So if you want to talk about diversity, boy, were we diverse back then. But after Akbar died, his son came, Jahangir, and he actually made the country better. He made our trade stronger, continued policies that made diversity better, and he loved art, especially painting. And under his rule, Indian art flourished as he wanted more artists to come to the country and he wanted artists to do more. Because we were very successful, it also caused other people to come here to share the success, especially those from Europe, particularly people from Portugal, Netherlands, and unfortunately England. Well, we did want spices, like our food is very bland, you know that. Yeah, but the arrival of the European traders also started a new chapter for India. And I wish I could tell you it was a good one, but it wasn't. Oh, it's my turn now? Okay, so in the late 1500s, people in England were hearing exciting stories about the wealth of the spices from Asia. Spices like pepper, cloves, nutmeg were very, very valuable in here. And they were not just to add flavor to food, like, yeah, we know our food used to be bland. Used to be? Okay, we got some bland food, but that was actually not the reason we wanted spices. We actually wanted them to preserve food. Like back then, there were no refrigerators, so putting them in those spices actually helped keeping them fresh for longer. But we weren't the first country to get that idea. Like the Portuguese and Dutch were already making huge profits getting spices from Asia and then selling them for crazy prices in Europe. And obviously everyone wanted them, so they were making their own prices. And the Portuguese and Dutch actually controlled places such as East Indies, which is modern day Indonesia. And we were like, okay, we want a piece of this profitable market. Like we can't just leave the Portuguese and Dutch to get all the profit. So in the year 1600, a group of English businessmen asked Queen Elizabeth I for permission to start a company that could trade in Asia. They were like, please Queen, we want to get stuff like valuable goods and spices, you know, they would be worth a lot of money here in England. So on December 31st of that year, Queen Elizabeth was like, sure, you guys can do that. And she signed a special permission called a Royal Charter. And by that, the East India Company was created. But the full name of the company actually was the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies, but obviously we're not going to call it that, and no one actually calls it that, so we were going to be calling it East India Company. Anyways, now East India Company had permission to trade in Asia and was protected by the English government. So they were excited to go to their first trip to Asia. So they took their first trip in 1601, and it was led by James Lancaster, an English sailor. And their goal was to reach the East Indies and bring back spices. And remember, East Indies is not India. East Indies is modern day Indonesia. So when the East India Company arrived to the East Indies, they had a big challenge. And it was the Dutch and Portuguese. The Dutch had already strong trade connections, and they even built forts in the East Indies to protect their spice business. And the Portuguese made stuff really hard for us. They were talking bad about us to the people in the East Indies while we were trying to protect them. You see what you did to India. Hey, we didn't reach that part of the story yet. Anyways, the East India Company realized it would be really difficult to establish a spice trade in East Indies. So they were like, okay, let's go to India instead. I really wish you didn't. Yeah, sorry about that. But you do have a lot of good stuff. You have good fabrics, good dyes for clothing, and spices. And we actually hoped that it would be an easier place to do business without facing as much resistance from the Dutch and Portuguese. But going there was not as smooth as we expected. So in 1608, East India Company was serious to make its first trade with India, and they chose Captain William Hawkins to lead the mission. So his task was to get permission from the Mughal Empire, Jahangir, to trade freely in India. And they knew if that mission was successful, they could gain access to India's wealth of goods like spices, textiles, and precious gems. So they set sail on a ship called the Hector, and the ship was filled with gifts for the emperor, and it had a special letter from King James I of England. And that letter was supposed to impress Jahangir and show that England wanted a respectful and profitable relationship with the Mughal Empire. So in August of 1608, after a long journey, Hawkins and his crew reached Surat, which is the port city in India. And Surat was perfect for trade. It was one of the main entry points, and it was perfect because, you know, the British will come and go from Europe to India. And they were optimistic and they were ready to trade without restrictions. But as soon as Hawkins and his crew arrived, they realized that things weren't gonna be as good. Yeah, that's because of me. We already were in India for like 100 years and we had a strong presence in Surat. And we immediately began spreading rumors claiming that the English were dangerous and unreliable, so local merchants did not want to trade with the British. Yeah, that was not nice. Yeah, bro, what I said was not a lie though. What you did to India was dangerous and unreliable. While despite the obstacles, Hawkins was determined. He managed to make his way to Emperor Jahangir's court, which was actually an impressive thing to do. And to be fair, Emperor Jahangir was known for being open-minded and curious about the world beyond India. So yeah, Hawkins hoped this would work in his favor. And Hawkins presented Jahangir with the gifts he brought from England, and the gifts included expensive fabrics, perfumes, and other things meant to impress the emperor. And he also gave him the letter from King James I, which praised the Mughal Empire and requested permission to trade. But what we didn't realize is that the Portuguese had already planted doubts in Emperor Jahangir's mind. Like, Jahangir did like Hawkins and welcomed him at his court, and he even invited him to dine there. But Jahangir did not want to give the English too much freedom to trade. That's because we were whispering warnings in his ear. But still, Hawkins knew he had to win over Jahangir. He even learned Turkish, the language commonly spoken in the Mughal court, because he wanted to show respect and communicate more easily with the emperor and his officials. And Jahangir appreciated the effort, and he actually started to see Hawkins as a respectable guest, and he even granted him a title and a place at court. So did Hawkins get what he wanted? Was he able to trade in India? All the East India Company wanted to trade with India without any limitations, but because of the British influence, the only thing that the emperor gave them was limited trade with so many restrictions. So after 3 years of trying, Hawkins knew he had to accept defeat. He realized that without any military support or stronger diplomatic backing from England, he couldn't achieve his goals, and the Portuguese was influencing India so much so he couldn't do anything. So in 1611, Hawkins returned to England, disappointed, but he was determined. And the East India Company knew that they had to go back to India, but with a different plan. So after Captain Hawkins returned to England with the disappointing news that he couldn't secure full trading rights with India, the East India Company realized they had to do so much more to make a name for themselves. And the problem wasn't just to get the Mughal Empire's approval, it was the Portuguese. And every time the English tried to establish trade in India, the Portuguese grew angrier. They even started interfering with the English trade routes, and they blocked English ships from docking at ports. And of course, the rumors that they kept spreading to the Mughals so that the people wouldn't trade with the English. But the English were determined, so they sent out a fleet led by Captain Thomas Best to protect their interest and to see if they can push the Portuguese back. But stuff was super tense between us that in 1612, there was a battle that happened between us and the English. Yeah, and that battle is called the Battle of Swaley. And we were kind of confident that we can just drive the English away. After all, we had more ships, cannons, and a lot more experience. But Captain Thomas Best, however, had a few tricks up his sleeve. Like, our ships were smaller, but also they're faster and more maneuverable. And even though they had more cannons, we had stronger cannons. So because our ships were smaller and faster, they can just go in between, and because our cannons were super strong, we actually did a lot of damage. And unexpectedly, we lost to the British. And because we won, we actually got a lot of respect from people in India. Like, they saw our fleet and they were like, okay, they're strong people, they can be trusted. And the news even reached the local merchants and the Mughal officials, and they were even impressed by our strength and bravery. The best thing about it is that we ended the Portuguese control in India. So after we defeated the British, we were like, we're unstoppable! But we also realized that winning that battle doesn't mean that we can just go into India and start trading as we want. Because even though we defeated the Portuguese, they still had powerful and close ties with the Mughal court. So the East India Company decided that it needed someone who could represent them not as a military force, but as an ally and a partner. So they decided to hire a diplomat, someone who could win over the Mughal emperor, and that person was Sir Thomas Roe. But when Thomas Roe arrived in India, he started causing problems. Because when he first arrived, the Mughals wanted to search his belongings, and he said that he got gifts for the emperor, but they were like, we still gotta search them. But Roe was like, I have diplomatic immunity, so it was a hard time to search his stuff. So the Mughals actually made Roe wait 44 days because of that, until they got bored and he was finally allowed to travel to the Mughal court. But see, that whole fiasco that he did actually got him some respect from the emperor, because the emperor thought that what he did was pretty cool. So when Roe met the emperor, he actually didn't talk about any trading privileges or anything. Instead, he wanted to have a friendship with the emperor. So Roe spent hours speaking with Jahangir, not about trade, but about art, philosophy, and the world beyond India. And Jahangir loved those conversations, and he began to see Roe not as a threat, but as a guest and a respected person. Thomas Roe knew what he was doing. He followed the traditions of the Mughal court, he observed the formalities, bowed at the right times, and he was careful to be respectful of the customs, so he knew what he was doing. But the problem is, the Portuguese still had influence in India. Yeah, we were still spreading rumors that the English could not be trusted. But Jahangir was impressed by Roe, but he was still cautious. He did not want to upset the Portuguese. But after years of building trust, Jahangir finally granted Roe and the East India Company permission to trade in India. But there were also some limitations. Like, the English were allowed to trade, but under strict conditions. They could only use specific ports, and the Mughal officials kept a close eye on their activities. But still, that was a lot better than the limitations they had before, so that counted as a win. Well, it was not a win for us, bro. So after finally building trust with the Mughal Empire, we got what we wanted. Well, it wasn't exactly what we wanted, but the British at least got some trading permissions. And now the East India Company began to build small trading posts. Also, they were known as factories. But they're not factories like we think of today, but they're like small hubs for trading and storage. And those trading posts helped East India Company to slowly expand its trade and valuables in India. And now the East India Company started their first trading post in Surat. And the reason that they picked Surat was because it's a busy port city. It was India's most active trade center. So now the East India Company were trading spices, silk, cotton, gems. They were doing good. And all of that with permission from the Mughal Empire. So far the East India Company had permission. But all of that success was not enough. The East India Company were like, we can do better. And then they established another trading post in Madras. So in 1639, they established a post in Madras after they purchased a piece of land from a local ruler. But they didn't only build a post, but they started building a fortified settlement known as Fort St. George. And it was basically a small town surrounded by thick walls to store all their goods. So basically the British were like, yeah, we got this area and it's ours. And a twist of history, we actually got Bombay from the Portuguese. How did that happen? Weren't you guys fighting? Well, in 1661, King Charles II of England married a Portuguese princess. And as a part of the marriage agreement, the Portuguese handed over the port of Bombay to the British. So basically, it was a dowry. You guys were giving my land as dowries? It's my land! Well, it wasn't the East India Company that had it, it was the king. So the East India Company saw the potential of Bombay and they leased Bombay from the British Crown for a small fee. You leased my land from the British for a fee? Well, what can I say? It was a good post. But then all that was not even enough for the East India Company. So in 1690, they established another post in Calcutta. And in there, they constructed Fort William. So another fort that had thick walls to have their goods protected. So after starting with a small post, the East India Company started making bigger and bigger strongholds. But they didn't just stop at trading. The East India Company also added guards, cannons, walls to each post. It was like there was a military over there. And that was when the British started expanding here in India. And as the British were expanding in here, we had our own problems to fix. Problems that didn't have to do with the British at first. And it started when Nawabs and Rajas wanted to be more independent. Wait, who are those? So Nawabs were appointed by the emperor to govern different regions here, and they were expected to collect taxes and maintain order, and they passed a share from their revenue to the emperor. And Rajas were also allowed to rule certain areas as long as they remained loyal to the emperor and also paid some money. But after the death of Aurangzeb, who was the last powerful Mughal emperor, the Nawabs started acting more independently and they started seeing themselves as the rulers of the land rather than being loyal to the emperor. And what is worse is that when the emperor died, there were a lot of fights among his sons on who would become the next emperor, because basically Mughals didn't have a clear line of succession. So when the emperor died, his sons would often fight each other for the throne. So instead of the royal family trying to help the empire, they were just fighting among themselves. And not just normal fights, like his sons actually fought in brutal wars to decide who would be the emperor, and obviously that weakened the empire. And because of those dumb wars, our money was getting drained. We had less money than we used to, and to make up for the lost money, the Mughals asked the Nawabs for more taxes, which obviously made them mad because who wants to pay more taxes? The Nawabs even started collecting taxes for themselves and did not send it to the emperor. They just kept it for themselves. So you can see how we started to be more and more divided. And as those fights were happening, a country realized that we were vulnerable, and that country was Persia, which is modern day Iran. And in 1739, Nadir Shah, who was the ruler of Persia, decided to invade the Mughal capital, Delhi. And he defeated the Mughal army and plundered the city. He took so much money and treasures, he even took the famous peacock throne and the Kohinoor diamond. And this invasion kind of showed everyone that the Mughals were no longer strong enough to protect their own land. And the problem is the British took advantage of that. So remember how I told you the Nawabs didn't care for the emperor anymore? Well, the Nawabs also wanted some power for themselves. So the British had some deals with the Nawabs, and the British were like, if you give us the land, we will give you protection. The problem is the British weren't helping the Nawabs against the emperor. No, they were actually turning the Nawabs against each other. And they called this tactic divide and rule, where they supported one leader against another by creating conflicts. By making those Nawabs fight each other, the British basically weakened their opponents without even fighting them directly. And little by little, the British started having more and more land. So now we knew we couldn't trust the British. Hey, why couldn't you? Are you serious? The East India Company turned people against each other. They caused more problems just so that they can get power. But one Nawab realized what they were doing, and it was Siraj ad-Dawla. And he was a young Nawab who inherited a powerful but kind of a complex state, which is Bengal, the jewel of India. And back then it was rich, like very rich. It had spices, rice, indigo. It was a pretty good place. And obviously the British wanted a piece of it too. But Siraj ad-Dawla realized what they were doing and he tried to stop them. And when he saw that the British were building walls in Calcutta, he ordered them to stop. But they didn't. So in 1756, Siraj ad-Dawla marched his army to Calcutta and he captured the British post and took control of the city. And he captured a lot of the British and he put them in a very small cell. And in that cell, many British prisoners died from heat and suffocation. That it was actually called the Black Hole of Calcutta. But that's when the East India Company were like, we cannot let Calcutta go. We need to recapture it. You realize it's my city, right? Yeah, but they still sent someone to take Calcutta back. And that person was Robert Clive. And Clive was a British officer known for dirty tactics. And Clive knew that defeating Siraj ad-Dawla would be almost impossible unless he had a plan. And not just any plan, a really dirty plan. So Clive went to talk to a man named Mir Jafar. And Mir Jafar was one of Siraj ad-Dawla's top generals, but also he was dissatisfied with Siraj. He didn't like his rule and he secretly wanted the power for himself. So Clive went to Mir Jafar and told him if he helped the British defeat Siraj, he would make him the new Nawab of Bengal. So Mir Jafar agreed, setting up one of the worst betrayals that happened in here. Yeah, that betrayal hurt us a lot. And then the battle started where Siraj ad-Dawla and Robert Clive clashed. And that battle is called the Battle of Plassey. And the British forces only had 3,000 troops, while the Indian forces were much larger, around 50,000. That was not it. The Indian forces even had elephants with them. But the problem is, the soldiers were less experienced and they didn't have proper training. But Siraj ad-Dawla was like, you know what? I have a good general. I have Mir Jafar with me, so he can lead the army. But however, Siraj did not know that Mir Jafar had already betrayed him and made a deal with the British. During the battle where it seemed that the Indian forces were winning, Mir Jafar did his part and he ordered his soldiers to not join the fight, and that confused the Indian army. Siraj ad-Dawla didn't know of that betrayal and he kept ordering his troops to advance, but many soldiers were confused. They realized something was wrong there. And when Robert Clive saw the hesitation in Siraj's army, he told his forces to push forward. And because of that betrayal, Siraj ad-Dawla lost. And after the battle, he was captured and he was later executed. And then the British instated Mir Jafar as the new Nawab, just as Robert Clive had promised. But we knew what we were doing. We didn't put him as a real Nawab. He was basically a puppet Nawab. He was very influenced by the British, who now basically held the power over Bengal's resources and economy. And the British forced Mir Jafar to pay them large sums of money, draining Bengal's wealth and making East India Company one of the largest companies in the world. And that's how the British had control of India. And we turned from the richest country in the world to a country that's full of wars and a country that's controlled by the East India Company. A company that promised trade but instead kept growing and growing like a virus. And because of that was our downfall.